Let me reintroduce myself. My name is Pyar Seth, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Johns Hopkins University. I come from a background in Black studies, film, social and cultural theory. So it would only be fitting that I find myself in an interdisciplinary program. Currently, I'm in the interdisciplinary humanistic studies program at Hopkins, pursuing a joint track in anthropology and political science. And broadly, I do work on Black sociopolitical life and death and questions related to death and data, as well as kind of risk and racism. I'm also a research associate to a new project funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Black Beyond Data. And I'm also a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Research Scholar. And I say that because I need to take a moment to thank both the Mellon Foundation and also the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for their generous funding support that has gone toward this project. So we can move to the next slide. Bridget, that would be great. So I suppose we can get started. So in short, there's a pretty robust literature on policing, carcerality, surveillance, and occasionally this research links to medicalization through thinking about the deinstitutionalization of mental health services and the collision of policing and social services, namely social work. And as someone deeply interested in kind of questions around medicalization, but also thinking about questions related to state power and the state more broadly, I then came across this diagnosis a few years ago, excited delirium. And I was like, what is this thing? Now, being from Virginia, I remembered the Natasha McKenna case, a Black woman from Virginia that had died in police custody back in 2015, I believe. And excited delirium was cited as the cause of death. And then more recently, I started to see this term quite literally pop up everywhere. It was alluded to in the George Floyd case, and then I saw it being cited here and alluded to in the UK. Kevin Clark.
Just carry on.
Carry on. But then I saw this, diagnosis, excited delirium, being cited and alluded to here in the UK. It appears in the Kevin Clark kind of case, Oslani Lewis, and I said to myself, what is happening? In two very different policing arenas and contexts, this diagnosis is a kind of common denominator. And so for me, I started to think about, one, the medicalization of police violence more broadly, but also that this diagnosis, excited delirium, is an example of how certain cultural and political claims about Black bodies move beyond the boundaries of the nation state. And so I wanted to explore the larger international, global, and imperial kind of processes. That is this question of how do we think about some of the geopolitical implications around policing and medicalization? And this is ultimately where my project emerged. So Bridget, next slide. So as I continue to develop my research question, we have the emergence of this diagnosis, excited delirium, which at its creation is not associated with Blackness or racial categories. Yet by the 21st century, we come to find this diagnosis employed as a justification and explanation for Black people that have died in police custody. And moreover, especially thinking about the racial reckonings that have occurred in the United Kingdom after the death of George Floyd, or the murder of George Floyd, I should say, we find numerous cases of British people dying at the hands of police being reopened, where excited delirium, or I think more commonly kind of cited or known or referred to here in the UK as acute behavioral disturbance, cited as the cause of death. And my question is, how does this come to, how does...
Can you just hold on mute?
Can everyone make sure they're on mute?
I think someone's not muted. Okay. So.
Great. But I suppose, we find a number of cases of Black British people dying at the hands of police being reopened, where excited delirium, or more commonly kind of cited here in the UK as acute behavioral disturbance, is cited as the cause of death. And so the question for me was, how exactly does this come to pass? How does the medicalization of police murder travel across national borders? And what can we say about this kind of transatlantic kind of pathologizing of Black life and death? And so next slide, Bridget. And now this point on medicalization is also something that I want to hone in on for a moment. Sociologist Peter Conrad famously described medicalization as this kind of interactive process by which a non-medical problem is defined and treated as a medical problem. And for Conrad, the core feature of medicalization is definitional. The use of medical language, the prescription of a medical diagnosis, the adoption of a medical framework, and the use of a medical intervention to treat a problem. Now, one of the cast of characters in the story that I'm going to tell today is Charles Wetli, and I'll say a little bit more about Wetli very soon. But In the initial studies done on excited delirium, Wetli says things like, cocaine users often experience, quote, intense paranoia and will showcase, quote, violent behavior in need of forcible restraint. And so part of my project is to think through
the great conference called the medicalization of Black Death, meaning like how
They're experimenting on.
yeah, but also like how
Could everyone make
how
sure
Black
they're on
people are
mute, please?
considered to be.
Where are they?
that is all right. I'll jump back. So one of the cast of characters in this story that I'd like to tell is Charles Wetli, and I'll say a little bit more about Wetli very soon. But in the initial studies done on excited delirium, Wetli says things like cocaine users often experience, quote, intense paranoia and will showcase, quote, violent behavior in need of forcible restraint. And so part of my project is to think through both the epistemic reorganization of health, disease, and medical care, but also how racialized ideologies and power make certain diagnoses possible. That is, how particular renderings of Black life and death are produced. So next slide, Bridget. But then as I was thinking through kind of questions on medicalization and all these various kinds of what you might think of as kind of constellations of governance, I thought about this line coming from Ida B. Wells, where she says, those who commit the murders write the reports. And so for me, this provocation made by Ida B. Wells led me to say, ultimately prompted me to want to do a deeper dive on this thing called excited delirium and really just start to get a sense of what is this thing, where did it come from, when, how, why, all of it. And ultimately, I ended up back in the mid-1980s reading the work of a forensic pathologist, Charles Wetli. Wetli, I should note, despite the heavy contestation around this diagnosis, Wetli is not a nobody. He was a Suffolk County, New York City medical examiner, I believe, best remembered for identifying all of the victims in the Trans World airline flight 800 in 1996. And he's often dubbed a, quote, pioneering forensic pathologist. So next slide, Bridget. So where are we headed today? Buckle up. We're going to do a bit of jumping around today, and I'm going to do my best to try to bring it all together. But fair warning, we're in for a small adventure. But here's a kind of brief outline of where we're going to start and where I'd like for us to end up. We're going to start in 1985, and from there, I'm going to fast forward into the 21st century. I'm going to try to bring everyone up to speed with this thing. Or really, what is this thing, excited delirium, that has started to generate a considerable amount of attention and circulate public discourse. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the materials that I've been drawing from that have helped me put this story together. And I'm going to then jump to our present moment to think about some of the conversations we're having today about excited delirium, talk about some of the questions that arise and emerge. And then I want to try and attend to the logic and the rationality within which some of these claims are being made concerning excited delirium and how they take their intensity, and reference some of the relevant literature and work that's been done on policing and medicalization that can help provide some further context, some additional kind of food for thought, you might say. And then I'm going to jump to the UK. This is a story that takes us across the Atlantic. And then I'm going to try to wrap up. This is a part of my ongoing dissertation work. So I'll end with discussing a little bit about where this project fits within the wider narrative that I'm trying to put together on Black sociopolitical life and death, but also thinking through questions related to diagnoses and also questions related to biological determinism. So next slide. And so, as I promised, the story that I want to tell starts in 1985 with forensic pathologist Charles Wetli and his colleague David Fishbane, where they looked to investigate a particular kind of puzzle. And this puzzle, or this puzzle for them was this: sudden death among individuals that ingested a non-lethal amount of cocaine. And in this study done by Wetli and Fishbane, the average blood concentration of cocaine average out to be roughly 0.6, and that's in milligrams per liter. So then I suppose you might ask, or there's this other question of, well, what exactly is a lethal blood concentration cocaine level? And some research has stated that a more standard approach to thinking about lethal cocaine ingestion is roughly 10 times higher than Wetli and Fishbane's average, so around 6 milligrams per liter. And so part of the puzzle that Wetli and Fishbane discuss in their research are the various kind of questions around drug tolerance and inter-individual variability. What has seemed to remain relatively consistent, though, is that the standard profile of a cocaine-related death is often that of someone that has a history of chronic high-dose cocaine usage. And in turn, with prolonged cocaine usage, several kind of researchers have documented a series of changes at the molecular, cellular, and tissue levels. And all of these changes ultimately lend themselves to favor something, towards sudden death. And so in the initial studies, in this initial study by Wetli and Fishbane, they looked to explain the cause of death among 7 individuals who used cocaine, all of whom were forcibly restrained, 5 of whom died in police custody. Interestingly, 6 of the 7 in the initial Wetli case series for this study were white. So there's a really important piece on race and racialization, which I'll certainly discuss a little bit more later. But with this notion that sustained cocaine use can lead to changes at the molecular, cellular, and tissue levels, researchers started to take note of an association between cocaine use and increases in pulse rate, blood pressure, and oxygen consumption. And so there's this way that cocaine use becomes linked to things like hypertension and heart disease in some of these early studies emerging in the 1980s. And so with all of this in mind, in the initial study done by Wetli and Fishbane, all of the individuals were deemed as having some kind of heart-related condition. And Wetli and Fishbane come to the conclusion that it's a combination of cocaine use, some kind of adverse physical condition, namely a heart condition, and the stresses of being forcibly restrained, particularly in police custody, that lead people to suffer from this condition that he would term, or that they would term, excited delirium. Next slide, Bridget. And so I should note that this term has been widely discredited. These lists are constantly changing, and there are probably more to add, but at the moment, the World Health Organization, the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, to name a few, do not recognize excited delirium. There are a few spaces, namely the American College of Emergency Physicians, that recognize excited delirium as a valid diagnosis. There is some movement with the National Association of Medical Examiners, so I want to name that. But at the moment, from my understanding, I do not believe they recognize excited delirium as a valid diagnosis, which has actually been a major kind of topic of discussion in medical examination more broadly. And when we specifically think about the UK, a 2020 investigation by the UK forensic science regulator found that the diagnosis should not have been used, since it has been applied in some cases where other important pathological kind of mechanisms, such as positional asphyxia and trauma, may have been more appropriate. So next slide. So for the next 20 years, we see a huge surge in research on excited delirium, some of which build and expand on Wetli and Fishbane, some of which draw upon Wetli's earliest studies on cocaine and drug use, and others are quite adamant about their skepticism around the nature of this diagnosis. And ultimately, after the American Medical Association raised concern about the biological pathways that Wetli advanced, in 2006, Wetli writes what you might think of as his defense of excited delirium. And in this defense, Wetli takes us through the history of delirium, not excited delirium, but delirium, which is a well-defined kind of clinical term, as well as provide us with a set of cases, toxicology screenings, and more to show how he's arrived at particular kinds of conclusions. And ultimately, he goes on to justify or assert his justification for this diagnosis. Next slide, please. And so from here, I find that there's a really interesting question about process, the mechanisms at play, one could say, right? And in particular, how do we think about the production of medical knowledge within a setting that is so deeply invested in understanding cause of death? And there's also this question around what you might call the discursive formation of diagnoses. How and when do certain terms emerge? What do these terms absorb, and why, for what purpose? And these were some of the guiding questions that, for me, emerged from Wetli studies, but also when we think about, what happens when particular or various fields collide, what happens when epidemiology, biology, forensic pathology, the sociology of policing, and histories of race and racism meet. This is you can imagine the interdisciplinary scholar in me, so to speak. But I find that this diagnosis, excited delirium, might be an interesting kind of entry point, an interesting kind of gateway to think through some of these questions and some of these relations, and to think about the collision of particular kinds of disciplines. So next slide, Bridget. Now, in public discourse, there's been a grave concern, and rightfully so, that this term, excited delirium, is just another form of medical racism and medical violence. Roughly 43% of cases involving excited delirium involve someone Black. And at the same time, as I mentioned, I think it's really interesting to think about how Wetli is making certain assertions and how he's coming to certain kinds of conclusions, and trying to understand how certain medical logics, technologies, and strategies effectively reenact and adhere race to bodies. And so I decided to ultimately revisit some of these materials myself. which actually wasn't all that difficult to do because a good amount of these materials, autopsies, death certificates, and toxicology reports in particular, I've noticed, are often addendums to original autopsy reports. Many of these materials can actually be found online, especially after a high profile death. So that was the first part, or this was the kind of first part of the kind of archival suite that I did to help me understand this diagnosis, excited delirium. Next slide, please. And now, as I mentioned, in the initial Wetli study, 5 of the 7 individuals died in police custody. And so what we've seen more recently is that excited delirium has become specifically linked to policing. It's quite a kind of relational kind of diagnosis, and quite interesting when you think about a diagnosis that is formulated right within a very particular kind of context. And from police training reports, manuals, and protocols, we come to learn that police are trained to be aware and mindful of excited delirium as something that can occur. And so it's really interesting to think about how medicine and medicalization have become exceedingly more relevant in everyday police work. And also thinking about the role that medicine and medicalization play when we think about the police as an institution more broadly. And so through an examination of excited delirium, I find that we might also get a sense of how to wrestle with this question of, when and how do medical diagnoses enter policing. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned in my outline, I'm going to try to bring us to the present moment. Hopefully, George Floyd does not need too much of an introduction, but in case you have, in fact, been living under a rock for the last 2 years, George Floyd, the George Floyd case shook the entire world. And even after the footage was released from the media, we were told that the death or the murder, I should say, of George Floyd was not related to asphyxiation, but rather, quote, intoxicants and cardiovascular disease. And in the autopsy report, fentanyl and methamphetamine were listed, as well as heart disease and hypertension. Excited delirium was not actually cited. The Hennepin County Medical Examiner's Office ruled the case a homicide, and Chauvin was ultimately convicted. But Derek Chauvin's legal team alluded to excited delirium in both their opening and closing remarks, arguing that excited delirium was in fact a real condition and that it should be taken seriously. And also during the trial, forensic pathologist Bill Smock actually testified, saying that he did in fact believe that excited delirium was a real syndrome, a real diagnosis, but that the Floyd case did not fit the criteria. And actually also in the video footage that was released, one of the officers, Thomas Lane, can actually be heard on the body cam video saying that he's concerned that Floyd might be experiencing excited delirium. And this was a moment when excited delirium really started to circulate public discourse. You start to hear folks saying, well, what are they talking about? You saw the video, right? Chauvin has his knee on his neck. What are they talking about? Excited delirium? And so the George Floyd case, I find in particular to be a really interesting way to think about how excited delirium has kind of entered kind of mainstream public discourse. Next slide, please. But this was not the first time nor the last time that we would see excited delirium. This diagnosis has a history. And so here we have another case, Daniel Prude, which did not receive as much attention because of everything going on with COVID and George Floyd. But this case involving Daniel Prude actually happens the same year, 2020. Police were called to the scene to respond to someone having a mental health crisis. Prude was forcibly restrained and he ultimately died. The autopsy report cited asphyxia, but also excited delirium. I'm not sure if everyone can see, but in the bottom left, I put an image of Daniel Prude's autopsy where both are cited. And the toxicology screening came back positive for what is commonly known as, or commonly referred to as PCP. And here, so I want to pause here actually for a moment. And as we start to get the ball rolling, I feel it might be a good time to pause and draw attention to the toxicology screenings in both of these cases. And notice that neither of them say anything about cocaine. Now, sometimes something like fentanyl can be mixed with cocaine, but that's not necessarily the case. And so I just want to hone in on this for a moment. What we glean from the autopsies and the toxicology screenings, no mention, no explicit reference or mentioning of cocaine. Next slide, please. Taking us back a few years, back to 2020, or excuse me, 2019, we have Elijah McClain, 23. Sorry, this one hits, it always hits because we were the same age. But paramedics arrived to the scene and diagnose Elijah McClain with excited delirium. No cause of death was actually ever cited, but then in 2020, we saw this domino effect around cases where excited delirium was implicated, alluded to, or discussed. And so an amended autopsy of McClain's death was released in 2020, which cited a complication of ketamine administration when McClain was stopped by police for looking quote unquote sketchy. The police restrained him and paramedics tried to sedate him. And it was reported that they administered a level of ketamine that was twice the recommended amount of someone of McClain's body weight. And unfortunately, he passed away. Next slide, please. And then we have Natasha McKenna. And in this case, I should note that excited delirium was cited and circulated wider public discourse. And as I said to open, being from Virginia, I remember this case quite clearly. But to my knowledge, neither the autopsy nor the toxicology report have been made public. And so I want to take a moment here as well to draw attention to some of the brilliant work being done by Shatima Threadcraft and some of her ongoing work on Black death, in particular, how common it is for Black women to die in private. I actually believe she has a new book coming out quite soon on some of these things. But it's these set of ideas that ultimately jumpstart the movement, Say Her Name, which raise, I think, an incredibly kind of powerful question. Can we see her? Can we see Natasha McKenna? And so hopefully you start to get a sense of the importance of the information emerging from these autopsies, these toxicology screenings and the like, and the fact that we don't have access to this information in the case of Natasha McKenna, yet excited delirium is still implicated as the cause of death. There's this question of why is excited delirium being deployed at particular times, at particular moments, in particular places? So next slide, Bridget. And so from here, I actually want to pivot back to Wetli. As I mentioned, none of the cases from George Floyd to Daniel Prude to Elijah McClain, from what we can see, there's no explicit reference to cocaine. And in the case of Natasha McKenna, we really have no idea. There's no explicit reference to anything other than the fact that excited delirium was presumably her cause of death. And so in his 2006 defense, Wetli, to some extent, tries to standardize our understanding of excited delirium. And he says, you know, here are a set of signs, common presenting features of excited delirium. And he goes on to say that a person exhibiting signs of excited delirium will likely showcase unexpected strength and be totally impervious to pain. And I want to take a moment to take note of the language here. Now, in the initial studies, Wetli does not actually deploy race as a specific kind of category of analysis in his studies, but nevertheless, he tends towards this particular kind of logic that carries with it a deeply kind of racialized ethos dating back to the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, where physicians like Samuel Cartwright argued that Black people bore a, quote, Negro disease, making them insensible to pain, which subjected them when subjected to punishment. It's this kind of particular kind of imposition of racial categories, but also you see this kind of shifting between borders between, you know, the normal and the pathological. And even in the initial studies that Wetli's done on excited delirium, recall that he's saying things like intense paranoia and violent behavior necessitating restraint, forcible restraint. But furthermore, Wetli goes on to cite previous research done in the late 20th century that backed his claims on the validity of excited delirium, namely that sustained cocaine use in particular could result in sudden death. Next slide, please. And so here, Wetli gives us these 5 cases, 4 of which say this is what excited delirium is. These are the terms and conditions under which something like excited delirium is applicable. And he gives one kind of example of where excited delirium should not be considered an acceptable or valid diagnosis. The first, as you can see, references cocaine usage. The next is delayed death. Another case in which methamphetamine is discussed, another where mental illness is discussed, and finally a case where the level of restraint and force that police exercise is more likely to be the cause of death. And so next slide. And so from there, to conclude his defense, Wetli goes on to say the following. Although excited delirium is most commonly precipitated by drug use, cases associated with psychiatric illness have also occurred. Deaths from excited delirium are associated with a number of factors. And in the meantime, those in research, policing, and the like should keep up to date with the research and continue to ask questions and to kind of explore the nature of this diagnosis in further detail. So next slide, Bridget. And so what I find so interesting about some of these arguments from Wetli is that you start to see this really interesting kind of movement. This is far from the most elegant graph in the world, but suddenly cited delirium that was initially kind of linked to cocaine can now be used to describe any and all kind of drug use. And at the same time now also encompasses mental illness. And so I had this question of, well, how did that happen, right? How did excited delirium go from being at first a condition that emerges in regard to cocaine use, and now it encompasses a wide array of drug use from fentanyl to PCP, and also describes a mental health crisis. And the fact that it doesn't make any distinction about the kind of mental health episode or crisis that a person may be having. It becomes this very kind of meta diagnosis that at the very same time is almost inextricably linked to policing. It's quite relational, as I kind of mentioned. It's a medical diagnosis that exists within a very particular kind of context, police custody. Next slide. But on some level, we actually do have a framework or entry point into understanding what's going on here. So as I mentioned, Wetli's initial studies are done in 1985, and what's going on at the same time, enter Nancy Reagan, enter the Reagan administration, just say no, the war on drugs. Next slide. And there's a really important body of literature that helps us understand the reach, the power, and the scope of this discursive framing. Michelle Alexander shows us how federal drug authorities publicize the war on drugs using scare tactics and more to generate support for increased policing and surveillance. Khalil Muhammad chronicles the notion that Black people are a dangerous race of criminals that are only going to destroy our states and cities. And Elizabeth Hinton actually takes us back to both the Johnson and Nixon administration, arguing that the formulation, the war on drugs, likely doesn't happen without increased investment into policing and punishment that actually starts in the 1960s. And each of these texts show how from the 1960s through the 1980s, a period that runs through Wetli's studies, I should mention, we see that racialized social control is in fact a kind of governing logic, a governing kind of technology through the 20th century. Next slide. But then there's also this piece on medicalization. To quote Jonathan Metzl, he says, quote, from a historical perspective, race impacts medical communication because racial tensions are structured into clinical interactions long before doctors or patients enter examination rooms. To a remarkable extent, anxieties about racial difference shape diagnostic criteria, healthcare policies, medical and popular attitudes about mentally ill persons, the structure of treatment facilities, and ultimately the conversations that take place within. And so Metzl gives us insight into the racialization of diseases, but also, so do folk like Kathy Cohen and Dan Royals. And I think an important thing to consider when thinking about Cohen and Royals' work in particular is that there's this kind of compounding effect. What immediately follows the discourse around the war on drugs and the conversations we're having about cocaine, the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And so this is something that I'd like to explore further in the wider dissertation project. But I did want to name that these histories very much kind of fold and run into one another. And so next slide. And at the same time, there was this kind of transnationalization of the war on drugs. This language and discursive framing became a technique for identifying populations that must be governed in particular ways all across the globe. There was this kind of tracing of where substances come from and therefore where social disorder comes from. To use some of the language of Thomas Olson, transnational problem construction is, quote, a complex process of making a problem in one locality intelligible or concerning for those in other distant localities. And in Britain, there seemed to be, especially in the 1980s, right, there seemed to be this impending doom around cocaine in particular, this idea that, oh my God, Britain is next. And in a 1990 issue of the Sunday Times, ultimately said that of all the drugs that have beset the British scene in the last 25 years, cocaine is going to be the one that's going to rip us to shreds. Look at what's going on in the US, we're next. And so this is this kind of transnational kind of piece that I'm starting to think through. Next slide, Bridget. And this actually takes me to some of my ongoing archival work on deaths in police custody here in the UK. In particular, these are materials coming from 1986. A Black man, Anthony Lemard, died in police custody, and it was reported that he ingested, as you can see in this middle kind of image, the highest ever cocaine dose. Meanwhile, I believe his mother and several Black organizers from Kensington and Brixton that knew Lemard personally said that he was otherwise a really, really healthy guy. And there were several inquests made around his death. And so I'm still in the process of piecing the story together, but you start to get a sense of how these logics that are very much related to excited delirium start to move and unfold across space and time. But really what I find really fascinating about the UK context in particular is that after George Floyd, you start to see this push to reopen cases. You do see this with Elijah McClain in the States, but across the globe, we've seen various responses to this question of, well, what are we to do about our histories and legacies of police violence? And so it's really interesting to think about this kind of process of reflection, that is this realization, this reckoning, this moment of saying, oh my goodness, there's this thing, excited delirium, that pops up in the US that people seem to be really angry about. And now we're citing it. How did that happen? Why did that happen? And the like. And thinking about transnational problem construction as both the movement of particular discursive framings and diagnoses, but also how particular logics are detected and ultimately how and why they unfold in particular kind of settings, in particular kind of contexts. And also here in the UK, in the case of Olaseni Lewis, excited delirium was cited as the cause of death. And as you can see here, an inquest by the South London Coroner's Office cited acute behavioral disturbance, which from Wetli, we learned that acute behavioral disturbance and excited delirium are actually synonymous. From my understanding, acute behavioral disturbance is usually what appears in reports here in the UK, not excited delirium. And so it might seem a bit semantic, but then there again, there's this point on language. There's a world in which you can imagine someone saying excited delirium, what's that? Not knowing that acute behavioral disturbance and excited delirium are actually one and the same. It's again, this question of how language and logics not only move, but also how they change, even if at first glance that change might seem to be somewhat semantic. The next slide. And so, as I mentioned, this is a chapter of the dissertation. This is still very much a work in progress. So I really do welcome any and all feedback. But just to give you a sense of where this project fits within this wider narrative that I'm trying to put together, I have some work on what is tentatively titled The Threshold of Force, a paper that I actually hope to be sending out for review quite shortly. But in so many of the cases involving excited delirium, we hear about the individual needing to be forcibly restrained. And so this led me to think about this question of, when we say something like excessive force, what exactly do we mean? What made the force excessive, so to speak? And ultimately, how is something like excessive force, how is something like this measured and defined? So that's one part of the dissertation, as well as some further kind of historical work and contextualizing around this time period. I don't find it to be a coincidence that in the 1980s and the 1990s, concerns around cocaine and HIV/AIDS run parallel to one another. And so that's another part of the story that I'm in the process of building out or trying to piece together, as well as thinking about a whole host of medical terms and diagnoses that have appeared to enter police work, from PTSD to something like suicide by cop. And this work will continue back in the States, but I plan to be hanging out in the UK for a good amount of time at the National Archives at Kew, the Wellcome Library, the Black Cultural Archives, and more. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you all so much for being here. To my colleagues that are here in person, thank you all so much for listening, for being here. It's a privilege to be here. I look forward to your questions, comments, and even your concerns about the project. Feel free to contact me. I have my information up on this slide. And lastly, I just have to give a special shout out to my incredible advisors. Those who have been walking with me as I try to put this thing called a dissertation together. And that's Sasha White, Veshla Weaver, Vina Das, Ashante Reese, Clara Hahn, and Robbie Shiliam. You all are the best. Y'all are amazing. Thinking does not happen in isolation. It happens in between people. And so I'm so blessed to have such a remarkable group of conversation partners. And so now I'm going to zip my mouth. Thank you all again for being here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm just looking at the chat questions. So we've got about 15, 17 minutes for questions. So feel free to put them in the chat or to put a hand up on your Zoom. But we'll start with David, who's in the room.
That was incredible, really good. And a lot of time for the presentation, a script every second. I wonder whether it's worth trying to defend this concept of excited delirium, but in different ways to the way that you're using it. So when you talk about the relational dimension, for me, a psychoanalytic bell starts to ring very loudly.
Right. Say that one more.
A psychoanalytic bell starts to
Right.
ring. You can't really talk about the relational in that context without thinking about what's going on for the aggressors,
Right.
police,
Right.
in this context. So, you've got a force. Your job really is to use minimal, the police should use the minimal amount of force necessary to
Right.
restrain the situation.
Right.
They're doing exactly what is being attributed to the person that's murdered in these cases. It's to pain, they're paranoid, they've finally found the enemy that, is terrifying their nation. And they've got to do everything they can. There's incredible overuse of strength. And it is what's not said about that usually, I think, for those officers, it is intoxicating.
Right.
They're all acting in the same way.
Right.
So as you say, anxiety is about racial difference. So those are projective identification going on there. So I'm wondering, whether you need to rescue the concept of anxiety
Right.
as a cultural analysis of what happens when police officers act together in that kind of way to kill somebody.
Right. Right. I mean, that's a great question, David. Thank you for that. I mean, I suppose this piece on medicalization and how medicalization has entered kind of policing, and how kind of questions around, mental health and illness and disease have become exceedingly more relevant for everyday police work. I suppose there's this really interesting kind of way of just thinking about how certain things are being explained away. And in particular, how state actors, how the police are going about absolving themselves of responsibility. I suppose I think one of the things about Excited Delirium in particular is that you start to get a sense of just how, especially when we think about, time and time again, I mean, it's actually quite uncommon, for someone like Chauvin to be convicted. I think we start to get a sense of, the discourse, the language, the framings, the defense that are emerging from state actors and institutions. And it's really interesting to think about these defense as having this kind of medicalization or this medical kind of component to them. I absolutely, there is a way that Excited Delirium, I think, becomes absorbed into, very much kind of these notions around biological determinism, biological reductionism, and just kind of these innate kind of prescribed kind of categories of kind of racial difference. I suppose it's just this piece, especially when you get to the legal kind of apparatus, right? And the fact that police can so easily absolve themselves of responsibility. How exactly are they able to do that? And it's through kind of things like Excited Delirium. So I think that's kind of the one piece. And I think it's really interesting to, think about, as I mentioned, these collisions between particular kinds of fields. When forensic pathology enters the courtroom, what are the arguments? What are the defenses that are being made? And how is it that we can imagine a world where Chauvin is walking the streets? And I think Excited Delirium is just kind of one way to potentially kind of get at that. So yeah, great question though. I hear you. Yeah.
I wanted to build on that a little bit more and ask, I don't know if you've looked into it or whether you were planning to, about the way it gets used in court and contested in court. I mean, it is a contested concept, or is it, how does that play out in the court cases?
Yeah. So still in the process of exploring the legal side of things. I think, the one piece I think has really been interesting is that when it has been deployed, and this is the reopening kind of piece, I think folk are having questions about how exactly did this appear, right? In particular times, in particular moments. Why is it that all of a sudden we have some quote unquote expert witness coming in, to talk about Excited Delirium, whether or not it was actually implicated or not, as a kind of cause of death. I think it pops up in just very kind of strange ways. And that's part of I'd say probably part of the ongoing kind of dissertation work. And it
pops up generally in terms of defense of the police.
Oftentimes. And you will oftentimes see, maybe some of these, first kinds of reports, that police might issue, if it's, starting to circulate that there's been a death in police custody. Is that, especially because Excited Delirium is popping up in training manuals and protocols and the like. is that, our officers, took all of the necessary precautions, when it comes to something like acute behavioral disturbance, the knee on his neck wasn't, we're making sure that he can still breathe and the like. It becomes this kind of first line of defense. And so whether or not it's actually, in some of these autopsies and reports and the like, if an officer, and a lot of these cases actually don't even end up making their way, to trial, someone like Chauvin, like I said, it's very easy for us to imagine a world where he's just kind of walking the streets. There's, again, this kind of point on explaining it away. It's just, well, we took all the necessary precautions. It's in our training manuals. And so there's also this way that excited delirium can also, and maybe potentially other kind of medical terms, which I'm interested in kind of thinking through, just, we did what we needed to do because these are how our officers are trained to think about these particular kinds of conditions and what can happen in police custody. We did what we're supposed to do. Our officers are fine, and it kind of gets shoved away.
I'm going to turn to Megan's story, who's got a question about the training. So she says, thank you so much for your work. I was wondering if you know where excited delirium falls into police training. Is it part of the first aid course? What's weight is placed behind his training, or when it's spoken about within the profession? Right.
Very early. So they're typically in training manuals that officers will receive. So specifically, and it's interesting, I haven't seen this with excited delirium in particular, but something that I find really interesting about the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the States, there's an entire report kind of issued by the National Institute of Justice entitled The Law Enforcement Officer in HIV/AIDS. And it's about a 300-page report that I think goes out to almost every police department in the country, in the States. With excited delirium, it's a little bit more, it's not like that, right? Where it's an entire kind of report, a 300-page report, but typically in kind of intro police training manuals. And I think what's also interesting is that Thomas Lane in the George Floyd case, who I think says, I'm concerned that George Floyd might be experiencing excited delirium. He was a rookie police officer. And so that's typically where excited delirium kind of pops up, is in these kind of initial kind of studies. Just like if you end up in a situation where someone must be restrained, be aware of these sets of things. So it's typically in these kind of like intro kind of training manuals. I'm not entirely sure about, how this might be threaded kind of moving forward. And sort of like following up on, some of the research, and especially, and I think it's interesting to think about, in the 1980s or in 1985, this is something that is specifically, linked to cocaine. And then it encompasses a wide array of kind of, encompasses a whole host of things, from any and all kind of drug use to then mental health. And then especially when you think about the deinstitutionalization of mental health services, specifically in the States, what happens, does excited delirium pop up more in these training manuals? Is this something that, is thought of as, police really need to be thinking about this, since we're, the first responders now to folk that are having mental health crises. But typically, from what I've seen, it's usually these kind of intro kind of police training manuals, or kind of the first things that officers are kind of taught, when they're on the force. So yeah.
And then we have another question from Lubina, asked again about police training, but Dr. Gillian Stokes, I think it's directly just to me. I'd like to ask if you are examining perspectives about the roots of justification of the questionable historical belief that professionals in general medicalize and other people of African and Caribbean othered in and beyond medical discourses. So
repeat that last part one more time.
So I don't know if Gillian, if you want to ask the question in person, you could just.
Yes, I am. I'm quite happy to. Sorry, I'm battling children as well. It was me that my children landed on the microphone just at one point. So I do apologize for that, Pierre, earlier. I come from a background of medicine. I now work in sociology. I've made the jump across, and I've always been sort of very much minoritized within the professions anyway, but I always made me feel very, very uncomfortable, the way that it's very easy for professionals to medicalize other people of African and Caribbean descent. And that's why I thought the presentation is wonderful. And this is really important work, really important work.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, if you're going to, within your thesis, be discussing, this right of in the post-colonial world, that people feel it's okay to say that about people of African and Caribbean descent.
Right.
They don't do it about other heritages normally.
Right. I really appreciate you naming that, Dr. Stokes. I really, really appreciate you naming that. And so I do, in short, I do. There is the one kind of, the dissertation just seems to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So I'm trying to hone it in a little bit so I can actually finish it. But there is this other term that pops up in the West Indies, ganja psychosis. And I was like, oh my goodness, like you really are getting the triangle, right? In so many different respects. And so there's some work, there's a text, I'm forgetting the name of the author, I shouldn't be forgetting the name, but the title of the text is Dying from Improvement or Dying by Improvement, which actually looks at also Indigenous deaths, in Canada, as well as Australia, and the like. So, I mean, you really are starting to get a sense of, these discourses are not limited to particular kind of social groups or all sorts of different things, and so I don't know exactly how I can fit all of this into one project, although I'd absolutely love to. But this West Indian kind of thing, in particular, kind of ganja psychosis, I think, I had a moment, where, ultimately how this project kind of emerges is I'm saying to myself, why is it that every time someone Black dies in police custody, drugs are mentioned in some way, shape, or form? And even before you have the details of, any of the kind of relevant details, of a particular kind of case, you start to get a sense of how the story is going to unfold before, any of this stuff emerges. And so it's really interesting, you have this, kind of cocaine thing with excited delirium, and then ganja psychosis, marijuana. I mean, we heard that with Trayvon Martin, didn't die in police custody, but, was murdered by a kind of quasi-vigilante. And that was one of the first things we heard. Well, he had weed on his, on his person. And so I don't know. The fact that this kind of pops up in the West Indies is something that I'd like to also explore. Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right.
I'll be watching with interest.
I appreciate it.
It's so interesting. I really appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, don't worry about the kids. We've had a lot of technical mishaps. So Carol Young has asked, hi Pyar, excellent talk. I just wondered, has your work looked into the extensive links between medical experts who argue in favour of excited delirium in these cases and Taser? I'm aware that Taser International Axon have repeatedly paid expert witnesses and researchers to provide evidence or findings in favour of excited delirium and have produced materials promoting the concept to medical examiners and the police in the US. These experts are now popping up in the UK.
Yeah. So my work currently hasn't, aside from, I think that, kind of table that I kind of popped up on, these are the associations, these are the spaces, the arenas that generally do not recognize excited delirium. And here are the, spaces, the institutions, the associations that do in fact recognize excited delirium. I haven't looked at Taser International in particular. What I have seen generally though, and I think this is going to be really interesting to explore as more cases are just kind of being reopened, is that it does, I think I'd be willing to go on the line to say this, that there does seem to be this move of, and I think David, this also kind of speaks to your question of, this thing is generally not recognized as a valid kind of clinical diagnosis, and it seems to be moving in that direction, which is why so many cases want, there's this push to reopen so many cases, because excited delirium has been, pops up in the 1980s, and, has been cited, I mean, I don't think there's any kind of database on how many, times this has actually been cited. There have been a few studies, I think done in, Florida, Dade County, and the like. I think they compiled 100 cases and, found that, this is where this 43% of cases involving Black folk, where excited delirium is kind of cited. So I hope I'm doing a decent job of answering your question, Carol. For the most part, it seems like there's this kind of non-recognition of excited delirium. But it would be interesting to kind of think about, who are the group of actors, the institutions, the spaces, even if that is the case, that still do kind of buy in to this particular kind of logic. And also not only just medical examiners, but also the police, police institutions, if you think about, the fraternal order of the police or something along those lines, that would be really interesting to kind of think through. So, yeah.
Did you want to come back? Carol, you had an added bit. Did you want to speak directly?
It feels like.
Right, yeah, no, thanks very much for that, Pyar, and I think I can completely understand the constraints of your research, and because I had just popped that in the chat, I had a slight worry that people might think I'm trying to divert from the race angle here. No, the exact opposite. I'm interested in the taser link because this feels to me like yet another example of where white people of influence are actually exploiting or creating oppression for both a racist and financial motive. So it feels to me very much linking back to the old colonialism, empire, white ideology stuff. But thanks very much for that answer. That was very good.
Right. Thank you.
Great. I think we're probably about time to wrap up. I want to thank Pyar for that really, both beautifully presented, apart from my technological faffing around, but also very kind of really rich research on this area, and we will look forward to reading more about it when it's published. But thank you very much, and I would tell you what the seminar was next month if I could remember, but we will send out emails and sign up on the ethnicity website if you're able to. All right, thank you very much.